Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Human Capital Watch by the Conference Board. I'm Amy Yi. I'm the Human Capital Research Associate of the Conference Board. Today's topic is on what HR needs to know about general data protection regulation. So I'm here in New York and joined by two colleagues of mine. One is Mary Young, who is a Principal Human Capital Researcher. And thanks for joining us, Mary. And the other is Marian Devine, who is a Senior Human Capital Researcher based in Europe, and she's in remote today. Thanks, Marian. And I will introduce both shortly. The three of us are actually the co-researchers of this research study that we recently are doing on GDPR and its impact on HR data. And in a few minutes, we will share the key findings and insights that we gained by doing this research. So before we get started, I'd like to share some of the critical questions and issues that we will be answering today. So first and foremost, what is GDPR? So a lot of you may have heard of GDPR, and recently I'm sure that you've received many updated privacy statements from the companies of which you're a customer for. So today's webcast is not really focusing on the GDPR's impact on customer data, and we will actually not talk much about the key specifics of the provisions. But our focus is really on what's GDPR, the new regulations impact on the HR data. And in today's webcast, when we talk about HR data, we are referring to the personal data of full-time employees, contingent workers, as well as external job candidates. So as we were doing the research, we talked to a lot of experts from legal and from risk, as well as HR, analytics, data privacy from different companies. Many are actually found it really challenging to fully comply to this new regulation. So what are some obstacles that companies are facing in ensure that companies are in compliance with the GDPR? And also, what are some practical solutions to help those companies move towards compliance? So Mary, and I will share some specific examples with you. And last but not least, we are now living in a world with a growing amount of data, and especially personal data, and a lot of them are leveraging data and turning those data into insights to further benefit others and address certain needs. So as now GDPR went into effect, what's this new regulations impact on data processing, especially the human capital analytics? So these are the four questions that we will be answering in a few minutes, and a few housekeeping items to share with you. For those of you who are getting credits by participating in this webcast, please make sure that you stay online for the entire hour because credits are only available for participation in the live webcast. And this webcast is available for 3 types of credits: the CPE, HRCI, and SHRM. Make sure that you put your full name, email address, as well as specify which credit type you are requesting in the space provided. And now I'd like to introduce the 2 speakers of today's webcast, and I'd like to go with Marian first. Marian, would you like to say a few words to our audience?
Yes, hello everybody. It's great to join you here from the UK. I'm a senior researcher in human capital in Europe, and I've been in the Conference Board for a year and a half. And I've been doing a lot of work in strategic HR and transforming HR. And this has been a great opportunity to really get to grips with the whole important issue of data privacy and protection in Europe, where the sensitivity is very high. So I'm really pleased to be with you today.
Thanks, Marian. Mary, would like to go next?
Sure. So I'm Mary Young. I'm Principal Researcher for Human Capital. I joined the Conference Board 13 years ago, I believe, and it was to work on strategic workforce planning. And I think that's significant because much of the research I've done at the Conference Board has had to do with HR's use of data. So strategic workforce planning, human capital analytics, big data for HR, digital transformation and all the data that generates, and now most recently with my colleagues, GDPR. So there's been a string through here, and this has been this momentous turning point, I think, for the field.
Thanks, Mary. I'm really honored to be on the research team, and thank you both for joining us today. So audience, we like to make this webcast a really interactive show. So if you have any questions or comments about what we've shared, please feel free to type those comments in the chat box on your screen. So now let's get started. So, as many of you have known that GDPR is an EU regulation on data protection and privacy, and it went into effect on May the 25th, 2018. So what does GDPR aim to do primarily, and what exactly is personal data, and what types of data really qualify as a sensitive personal data? And I'd like to ask Marian to share some basics about GDPR with us. Marian.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the thing to really appreciate about the GDPR is that it's really a fundamental change in EU data protection, and it's seen as the biggest change in the last 20 years. And it's replacing directives which are implemented on a national basis, and really we've had a patchwork of national laws. The General Data Protection Regulation is one law, and it comes into force, and it is now in force. And all member countries of the EU and the European economic areas have adopted it. So that's the first thing. It's a very big change. Countries have had privacy laws for several decades based on the OECD model and the Council of Europe. So the recognition of privacy as a fundamental human right has always been there. But what we have now is that the recognition that actually technology has moved so fast that we're actually finding it very hard to keep up. And we are seeing the use of big data, we're seeing a convergence of technology, data can be shared and stored, and it can come in all sorts of guises. It can be video, it can be biometric. So there's been this explosion in data, and the realization that in Europe that the regulations needed to be updated. So effectively, the GDPR is extending the rights of individuals. So some of the rights were there under the directives, but these have been expanded to give them so much more control over how their data is used, especially around the whole concept of consent and the right to be forgotten. And the other big difference is that the law requires companies to demonstrate compliance. And there have been good practices around, but the GDPR is actually bringing these good practices into a requirement that you should be doing these things because they are a way of demonstrating that you are compliant. So it's putting a lot more accountabilities and responsibilities on companies who process data.
Thanks, Marian. What about personal data? Would you like to share a few examples about personal data and maybe sensitive personal data? What's the definition of the two?
Yeah, Amy, I think the important point is that the GDPR gives a much broader definition of personal data. So it's much more extensive now. So we've always had protection around available personal data. But now the GDPR actually extends it, and it talks about personal data that directly or indirectly identifies someone. But there's also a special category, and you can see on the slide, this includes race, ethnicity, politics, religion, trade union membership, genetics, and now biometrics, and also health, sexual life, or sexual orientation. It's very comprehensive. It's hard to think of anything that's not in that definition, really. But not just that, it's also extends the definition of it's also publicly available personal data. So it's data that's both also in the public domain. So any companies that supplement their own people analytics data by scraping public platforms like LinkedIn or job sites or Facebook, they now need to give the same security and protection and data rights to the people that they're taking this data from. So it's public data. It's not just employees, it's all type of workers, so contractors, contingent workers, and that could even be passive or active job candidates in a company's external sort of talent acquisition processes. So that's a big change as well. And then finally, it's unstructured data. So companies tend to have all sorts of sensitive personal data that we would call unstructured, and it might be employee discussions on the social media, it might be in emails, it might be in video clips. It's sort of qualitative data. And according to our experts, this is the area that, quote unquote, companies are really sweating over. And in fact, a senior leader in one of our meetings sort of said, oh, unstructured data, HR data, is like a buffet for any data protection authority to come in and find something on us that we haven't put under GDPR. So that's a big cause of anxiety for companies. They know that they have lots of unstructured data, it's hidden away, And also it can be stored and forgotten about for years. It could be in old file shares and shared drives, SharePoint, content repositories, spreadsheets, you name it, it could be out there.
So I will just throw in a couple other examples, Marion, from the world of human capital analytics, because you've mentioned a whole lot of good examples of unstructured data, but we're also seeing new ways that companies can collect and analyze data. So for example, we've written in our previous research about new technology like sociometric badges that employees, when they agree to wear, can wear and will capture information about who an individual interacts with, not what the interaction is, but the communication patterns. Do you interrupt people a lot? Do you talk over people? Do you have equal shares in the conversation? Organizational network analysis that looks at not only who do people interact with, but how, when you combine that with performance data, how do the social networks of the best salespeople compare to the average salesperson? Or, what are the most productive or the most innovative teams? How does their interaction pattern change? So we have, with the constant evolution of technology, more and more sources of data and more ways of capturing it and using it, all of which can be of immense benefit to the company. So this list is going to constantly be evolving.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, and so I think, that half asks our next question, the question we asked in our research, why is the GDPR particularly important to HR? Well, first of all, HR probably is sitting on the largest amount of personal data and personal sensitive data. So that's the first thing that Mary's just said, really. So HR has got a huge stake in this whole area. Effectively, the GDPR also is a global law in effect, because it's very comprehensive, and the lawyers have sort of struggled around this one to get the clarification. But basically, any organisation that's based in the EU and that processes the personal data of anyone, it doesn't matter where they are, but if that organisation is based in the EU, it is subject to the GDPR. So that's the first one. And the second one is that any organisation, so help me, Mary, any organisation that processes the personal data of EU residents, regardless of where the organisation is based, and any organisation within the EU that controls or processes worker data, regardless of where the employee resides. So you could be a company based in the EU, you're subject to the GDPR, so that covers you if you have employees outside the GDPR. And similarly, if you are just an organisation, a third-party company that's processing data, such as a vendor, you're subject. So basically, anyone who does any sort of processing within Europe or around European residents is subject to the GDPR. So, and there is an interesting sort of definition of what it means to be based. The EU talks about, the regulation talks about established, and that's basically any stable activity. So again, it's not necessarily, even if you're not necessarily a legal entity, if you're established in the EU and you have some sort of stable arrangement for processing data, you're covered by the GDPR. And this is really getting the attention of the C-suite, because this really means that companies really have to sit down and think, right, are we covered? And the consequences of non-compliance, and as I think probably our audience are aware, is very, very high. 4% of global revenue, or 20 million euros, whatever is higher. So if you're a big company, this could be millions, absolutely millions in fine. And not just that, it could do terrible damage to your reputation. And I think, therefore, the stakes are high, and this is definitely getting the attention of the C-suite that we've seen in our companies.
So Marion's just mentioned, you want to talk about purpose and consent first.
Yeah, I think, Mary, that something, this is an area that we've really seen our member companies really talking about, because The big difference, again, with employee data is that consent, just getting explicit consent from employees is not enough to justify processing their personal data, because the GDPR adds a presumption that consent isn't freely given if there's a clear imbalance between the individual and the data processor or the controller. And as an example, it cites the employer and the employee. So under the GDPR, the regulation does not believe that an employee can freely give consent. So they don't necessarily have a real choice because of the imbalance in that power relationship. So this means that, first of all, consent is a higher standard, first of all, for anything. It has to be freely given, it has to be specific, it has to be informed. It can no longer be inferred. And it also has to be specific for every processing operation. But for employee data, you have to do more than that. You actually have to have an additional lawful reason for processing the special categories of personal data. This is where it gets really tricky, really. So you might be able to process something that is personal data that's necessary for the performance of a contract. So that's fairly straightforward. Pay, compensation, benefits, processing requests for sick leaves, vacation, that's fine. You also, secondly, can process employee data if it's required by employment, social security and protection laws. Fine, HR as well is familiar with this. But the one that's a third sort of possibility is for more complicated areas, for example, data analytics, they're not necessarily covered by those first two reasons. So the other one that companies will probably have to resort to is to processing to achieve the legitimate interests of the employer or the third party, like the parent corporation. And how you define legitimate interest is quite tricky. And whether that justifies processing that could be seen as quite intrusive by regulators, for example, biometrics, some sort of biometric monitoring or location monitoring, the regulators may not necessarily see that as fully justifiable. So you have to find a legitimate interest, and explicitly it mustn't be at the expense of your employee. So there has to be this balancing of interests. So it means that the whole area of consent for companies is quite a difficult area, and there's a general feeling that companies are going to have to test the waters, and maybe will have to look to companies being perhaps prosecuted by the regulator to sort of see just how far legitimate interest can be stretched.
Thanks, Marianne, for sharing the specific scenarios and the challenges when organizations are dealing with these two specific requirements. So what are some additional obstacles that we have seen and we have heard from companies? And Mary, would you like to share some?
So Marianne's just given us some great examples of the complexities of this law and how it applies to HR data. And in our research, we heard again and again 3 obstacles from HR people and from legal counsel and from risk people. And the first of these is that the regulations, I think as Marianne has illustrated, are quite unclear. And many companies are waiting to see who gets slammed and what they get, what are the regulators going to care about? Or what does a legitimate business purpose mean? So there's a lot of ambiguity. Our risk colleague, Ellen Hexter, pointed out to us, she said, this is not unusual. With new regulations, there's always ambiguity. So that it isn't particular to GDPR, but it is, even in our interviews, we found companies or legal advisors who understood this slightly differently from one another. And some companies are more risk adverse, some are more conservative than others. So there is the ambiguity, as somebody said, there's a broad range of interpretations and many conflicting stories, and we heard those in our research. The second big obstacle that HR faces is that historically HR has been a whole hodgepodge of different IT systems in different locations with different kinds of data. And as long as we've been doing research on how companies can leverage human capital data, we've heard one of the big challenges is that we have so many different systems. And this becomes really problematic if you now have a legal mandate to manage those systems and ensure that what their processes that they're doing are all compliant. And the more systems you have, not only is it the more work, but there's the more room for error in aligning these with good data protection practices. So that's the, one of our interviewees said, any Fortune 250, 2,500 company today may have 100 to 150 discretely operated software systems. So that's big obstacle number two. And the third big obstacle, and this that is particular to HR data, is I think that there is more likely to be data that isn't necessarily cataloged or visible. So it's everything from the hiring manager who keeps on his desktop or her desktop the files of some resumes of some really promising candidates who didn't make it into the selection process but look really good for something else. Or it could be the recruiter who develops an external network of people who aren't looking today but might be interested in the future and have very rare, hard to find hot skills. It could be, could be any number of things, but there isn't a map in most organizations to what information is where, how often it's updated, who sees it, who can use it, how it gets used, etc. And for this reason, there's a kind of, it's a bit of a black box. And this is something that HR isn't responsible for cleaning this up on their own. Actually, it's an enterprise issue. It's a risk issue, a legal issue. It's a board level concern. But HR is closer to that data than anybody and knows more about what it is and how it's used. But this is another huge obstacle, and that data can be anywhere.
Thanks so much, Mary, for sharing those obstacles. And just want to check with the audience if hopefully some of the obstacles and challenges are that you have seen in your journey towards compliance as well with GDPR. And if you have any questions or just comments or some similar challenges, feel free to share with us in the chat box on your screen. So as we talk to the leaders in risk, legal, HR, and data privacy, we actually found some effective strategies and practices they use in moving towards compliance. So we actually, to help you make it easier for you to conceptualize, we categorize and group them into 6 different buckets. They are culture, strategy, structure, system, data science techniques, and digital platforms and tools. So Marian, would you like to start with culture and strategy first and to give the audience a little bit examples of this too?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Yes, I think based on what we were seeing with our interviews and our conversations with members, when it comes to strategy, companies really have 3 basic choices. They can opt to just comply, although the question that one of our members put was, what is compliance? What is just enough for compliance? So they can opt for compliance and just say, right, we're just going to emphasize that, just obey the letter of the law. They can also seek, someone mentioned saying, well, maybe we'll just try and be the middle of the pack. We won't be at the end, so we won't get picked off by the regulators. That's another kind of strategy for GDPR. Other companies that we spoke to talked about, we want to be leading the pack. We've got to do this. It's a huge effort, so we might as well do it really well. And actually, some of our companies are electing to adopt GDPR as the one global set of standards across the whole global or international business. And they've sort of said, it's a gold standard. If parts of our business are going to be operating the gold standard, how come other parts of our business not be? So let's just bring it all together rather than having multiple complex, different rules for different regions. Let's put it all together and have one global set of standards. And then finally, there's a distinct group of companies who are saying, if we do this correctly, we can turn it into a real source of competitive advantage. We can use this to build trust and credibility with our customers, trust and credibility with our employees. And I think that leads me into the second, let's say, soft sort of strategy in a sense is culture. I think regardless of what sort of strategy you take for GDPR, it's going to impact your culture. At the very least, you're going to have to have much more openness. You're going to have to communicate much more to your employees because of this whole area of consent and legitimate purpose. So that really means that analytics in general and HR metrics, reporting analytics, you're going to have to really explain to your employees why you want the data, how you're going to use it. And this is going to have an impact on the culture. It means as well that to get that sort of dialogue going, you're really going to have to understand your employees' concerns. And we also know that attitudes towards privacy are very nuanced. They're very culturally based. So actually, again, companies in communicating with their employees, they're going to have to understand how people think about privacy, and understand the difference between privacy and data security, and actually really, have this thoughtful dialogue with their employees. And I think as well, finally, in terms of culture, there is this thing about accountability as well. The GDPR is complex. With HR data, it's all over the place. We're not just talking about HR, we're talking about IT, we're talking about lots of different functions. We're talking about business leaders who often go to data analytics and ask them for something. And so all these people across the organisation are really going to have to be held accountable. They need to understand the GDPR. They need to understand their role. And again, this ultimately means that you could have a much more data-based culture, really, because people need to understand how you're using data across the organisation. So the cultural area is pretty big.
Thanks, Marianne. Mary, would you mind talking about the structure and system? And before that, I would like to share a question from one of our audiences. What groups within an enterprise are being tasked to audit for GDPR compliance? Are you finding companies have created audit programs for GDPR?
This is a great lead into the two areas of compliance or solutions that we wrote about, and you can read about. And I'll just mention that because of time, we're really just giving an example or two for each of these, but in our report, you'll find much more detail, and we hope you'll take a look at the report, which will be released the last week of June, and we're very excited about that. So the question had to do with who's auditing and what are the sort of systems or structures that companies put in place to ensure compliance. And I think one of the big takeaways here is this cannot, although we're talking about HR data, this is not just all on HR's shoulders. This is too important, frankly. And it's also it doesn't just involve HR data. So we saw companies creating structures. They may already have a data governance structure. They may already have a data privacy executive, information systems executives, but it's about bringing those stakeholders together. And one of our observations is that in many companies are thinking most of all about consumer data, sales and marketing data, and they're not yet as aware of the data that HR has or could have and how it's being used. So HR really needs to be part of that group and at least coming up with what's our strategy need to be, what are some of the objectives. So a centralized enterprise level structure for overseeing GDPR compliance along with other issues in terms of data protection, cross-functional. And there are very specific roles. Companies need to have they need to have a controller. They need, in one of our case studies, we saw that there were roles at the local level which were paying attention to local regulations, and then there were enterprise level roles, and they were complementary, but there were accountabilities built into those. And you can read more about some of those structures in our report. But another thing I wanted to touch on briefly, GDPR calls for something called privacy by design. And that is a way of ensuring when you design your information systems, when you design your data collection, your data processing, your data storage processes, that these are all designed with privacy in mind, to ensure privacy from the get-go. Because right now what we're doing is we're playing catch-up. We're having to sort of retrofit all of our systems and our data to ensure compliance. But going forward, how can we build this in, hardwire it in to our use of data? So I want to show you an example we found really interesting, and this is from a global pharma company. And what they described, and they were really quite confident about their being prepared, well prepared, because they've been thinking about data protection ever since they'd gotten into the whole area of human capital analytics. And what they described to us was 3 discrete systems, information systems, that couldn't communicate with each other. And by making it impossible for them, creating these barriers through separate systems, they were ensuring that there would be protection of data appropriate to GDPR. So here on this map, you can see on the left, represented by those black little markers, are the local systems, which are overseen locally and need to identify individuals because you're dealing with very basic and critical HR information like time and attendance and pay, etc. And that data is only accessible to local data users, data controllers, etc. Then at the enterprise level, there is another system which encrypts the identities of all individual employees and by assigning a number to them. And that's sort of the master control, if you will. And then thirdly, there's a global talent management system where all the HR activities with data take place. So the head of human capital analytics doesn't have access to the local level individually identifiable data, but rather is looking at anonymized, because it's been encrypted, and aggregated data in order to understand trends in the workforce and to understand critical relationships between factors like tenure or location or whatever, and outcomes that the business cares about. But in this way, they've established data protection by design, and that is exactly what the GDPR asks for.
Thank you very much, Mary, for sharing the great example. And as more companies start to comply with the GDPR, I think they were like updating their systems, also like integrating systems. So we will probably see more examples of those different information architecture. And organizations are also like appointing like data protection officer to help with GDPR compliance and to oversee the entire data management of the organization. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the data science techniques and digital tools that we've seen as we interact with some companies. So as I want to go back to what Marian just mentioned about the legitimate business purpose when processing data. So a lot of times I think organizations in the past would just collect all the raw data and try to analyze that. And I think under the new GDPR, this will be a problem. So we really need to think about what are the business questions that you want to answer by collecting and analyzing the data. And perhaps in certain scenarios, you can just analyze the data at the aggregate level, because aggregate data is not subject to GDPR. Excuse me. Or maybe just from the beginning, if you are only looking at the trends of those employees, you probably can just collect the data anonymously from all the employees versus those personal data. And another common strategy that we have seen from some companies is called pseudonymization. So it's a data management and de-identification procedure that employs personal identifiable information is replaced with one or more artificial identifier. For example, as we talk to a global tech firm, and they are, in order to do a study that using the personal data, they are actually employ the techniques called data hashing. So they replace every individual's name with a 32-digit long number to, it's actually a unique number to replace the name of those employees. And whenever they receive new information about the employees, they just want to make sure that their data is tied back to those unique identifiers. And another way is data encryption. So translate data into a secure code so that only those people who have keys can get access and decrypt the data. So that's about data science techniques. And if you are working in the human capital analytics space, and if you have some other solutions, please feel free to share with us. The last bucket that we will talk about is about digital platforms and tools that are emerging in the business world due to the emergence of the GDPR. So if you do like a Google search, just say GDPR compliance tools, you probably will see a lot of new startup tools that to help organizations comply to GDPR. For example, I've seen that some companies actually offer that email templates to help organizations to ensure their email language to employees and to customers are compliant with GDPR. And also, under the GDPR, employees have different individual rights. For example, they have the rights to rectify the data, they have the rights to be forgotten. So with so many data-related requests, some organizations actually offer the platforms and tools to help organizations comply to GDPR and collect all the requests at one place. So that's about external, and internally, as Mary just mentioned, a lot of B2C companies are focusing on the customer data. So their marketing teams and other IT and legal teams may have already some updated systems and tools and platforms to help them comply to GDPR from the customer standpoint. So HR may be able to leverage some tools internally to help them to comply with GDPR from the employee data perspective.
Amy, I'd just jump in and say I think this could be a real opportunity for HR, because we've been hearing for years that we have these disconnected systems, or we don't have a consistent language across locations, and our data is all over the place. And this mandate for GDPR and the fact that it's really gotten the boards and the C-suite's attention means this is a great time for HR to say, we need some data scientists. We need some better systems. We've got to invest in systems integration, et cetera. So I see this as potentially a good time to partner with that centralized data governance group, with your IS leaders, IT leaders, to think about what investments would help make us more compliant.
Absolutely, very good point. Thanks, Mary. So let's talk about the big picture. So Mary, would you like to share the impact of GDPR?
So I know many of you in our audience are responsible for various areas of HR. And we can all, in our worlds, tend to get our blinders thinking about, what it is we're responsible on a day-to-day level. But I want to pull back a moment and say, paint a bigger picture. And I think that GDPR is just a sort of momentous watershed event that reflects some very significant, much bigger changes in the world. And in fact, historically. So let me just talk about what we just see as two colliding forces, and it's the intersection of those forces that brings us to today and our massive concerns about GDPR. So about personal data. So the green arrow represents the growing business value of data, all kinds of data, including personal and sensitive data. You've probably heard the truism that data is the new oil. In other words, it's both this valuable input that helps companies produce products, but it is also a product in and of itself. Companies that can use their data and find new ways to sell it, they can find ways to use it to gain insights from it that help them develop new products and services. So it's both an input and an output, and it produces tremendous value. And it can produce even more as companies get better and better at collecting it and leveraging value from it. So the point is this is going to be enterprise-wide, this increasing harvesting of data, and no company is going to walk away from it and just say, we're not going to do that anymore. If they did, that would be a tremendous competitive disadvantage. So that's the first force. And data, we know, is going to just keep increasing in velocity and volume, et cetera. So it's not going to go away. That's the first thing. You can't just turn your back on this like a Luddite and say, we're not going to do that anymore. The second trend that's happening exactly the same time is a growing public awareness of the potential misuse of personal data. And, we've had recent very high visibility events like Cambridge Analytica and Facebook that really drive this home, but we can guarantee that going forward, there will be more events, whether they're data breaches or whether they're, exposés of usage of personal data that people didn't know about and certainly didn't agree to. So that's going to keep happening. And therefore, this trend toward greater awareness or a diminishing trust in the use of personal data is happening at the same time. And that's why we feel this tension today. The good news is that decreasing trust in the use of personal data is something that companies can influence. They're not powerless here. Our research has identified some of the steps that they can take, but I also think business collectively has a common interest in figuring out how do we do this better, and how can we reap the value without destroying public trust, without alienating our employees, remaining both legal and ethical in our use of data. And I think that's the promising part is that whether it's through technological solutions or whether it's through regulations or whether it's through internal codes of conduct, companies have an ability to influence that red arrow. So those are the kind of big picture considerations. This is much bigger than your company, really much bigger than business.
Yeah, thanks, Mary, and thanks for saying that personal data is not going away, but analytics people need to be more cautious when processing the data.
And more creative.
Yeah, exactly. So we actually got a question about from someone who probably works in the learning and development field. So how does the GDPR affect learning and development professionals, like training records, evaluation surveys, test scores, and what are things that we need to be cautious about or think about?
Maybe I can start, and others of you will have additional ideas, but I think there are legitimate business purposes. HR is responsible for meeting employment regulations and keeping records, and this is part of talent management. And so some of these things I think fall under that category, just as a company has a legitimate interest in tracking your pay and tracking your performance reviews and tracking your career progress and the credentials that you presented when you came in. Those are all legitimate purposes. They're part of the employment regulations and the employment relationship. I think that some of that L&D information would certainly fall under that.
Yeah, I just want to add, and again, it's about legitimate business purpose. And also I think from that perspective, it's also not just the business, something that's the purpose for the business, for the organization, but also might benefit the employees. So thinking about like the incentives for employees, those learning and development training records, evaluation, test scores will actually help those employees learn and grow. So it's actually, if you communicate that clearly with employees, they will provide their consent.
Yeah, you really make an important point about what's in it for me. And the employers, your ability to frame how employees would benefit, I think is really critical, both to proceeding and being able to do some of this. And we've seen companies where information about how you develop yourself, not just through training courses, but through job rotation or through finding mentors or reaching out on your internal social platform to find people who are in jobs like the ones you want to do or who can teach you something you need to know. All of this is very empowering to employees. And that's part of the what's in it for me.
I think as well, something that one of our members said to me the other day, well, they were talking about wriggle room when it comes to the purpose. So they were sort of saying, the trick is not to be too specific on purpose, that it's a straitjacket, but actually to think of the bigger defining purpose. So, and I think that this is something worth thinking about. So, for example, with professional development, there are some bigger, overarching objectives rather than, to train this person in our health and safety policies. So they were talking about, really becoming sort of clever at defining purpose in a way that is elastic enough, but is ethical and is legal. But I think that, we've heard a lot of our members talk about, is this the end of confidential data? And perhaps it is. Employees have the right to access this data. So I think you have to, again, think about what is this data that you're holding on them, and to really be mindful that it is beneficial to them. But I think nothing, there isn't going to be any place to hide for anyone really who's dealing with employee data.
Thanks, Mary and Valerie. I hope our answers at least address part of your question. And other audiences, if you have additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. So Marian, when you were talking about the culture, you were mentioning the trust, and also Mary also mentioned that. Would you like to briefly talk about that, why it's important under GDPR?
Yes, Amy, I think this is just really coming from my direct experience. I was with one of our councils, and a lot of the members of the council were executives who were dealing with analytics, people analytics, all in HR. And we were talking about the GDPR and the impact on them and what they can do. And I expected us to really talk about, methodology, to talk about anonymization, pseudonymization. I thought we would talk about AI, machine learning, algorithms. We did a little bit, but actually the conversation with these international companies kept coming back to trust and context. So some of them were in a context where they were actually in slightly adversarial relationships with their works councils. And they were saying about how difficult it was in that sort of context where GDPR, they felt, could well be used as, quote unquote, a weapon by the Works Council. So they were talking about how do we change this? If this is happening, how do we really try and build new trust with our Works Councils? And there were other companies who had really great relationships, but who were still saying, okay, now we have to be very open, very transparent. So I think that it was very interesting that we ended up, the conversation was very much about the need to be ethical and legal, the need to be open, transparent, the need to really work with employees, to actually share why you want to do something and what are the goals. So the group really talked about the fact that there was that part of trust was really focusing on the actionable strategy, and how that would, how the analysis of the data was actually going to benefit the company and employees. It was going to result in action. It wasn't just nice to have, good to know. The company wasn't just pulling together data for the sake of it, which can sometimes be the case. And they were also talking about just the fact that in really having to create trust with employees, they had to really help everyone in the company understand what they were doing and why. And that meant also making sure that the work was going on with some sort of sponsor in the organisation. So it wasn't just sort of being done in isolation, but it was really owned by the business. And again, people knew why they were doing it and what the possible benefits would be. And in fact, one or two companies even talked about the need for a manifesto. They had actually worked with their works council. One company in particular was a fascinating example. Their works council was very distrustful, and they sat down with them and they said, right, we're going to kind of have this sort of charter with you. We're going to agree with you how we're going to use your personal data under the GDPR. And we're going to set out these principles. For example, one of the principles was to only really use analytics in the context of something that was constructive and positive, that it wasn't going to be used to do things that actually employees would feel was to their detriment. And also that if they were taking any decisions based on data, that it would never be just data in isolation, that they would talk to the employee, they would talk to the manager, that they would look at other forms of evidence around whatever analytical sort of exercise they were doing. And so they were saying that it was really important to establish this with the Works Council, that they were going to stick to these principles. And this person had required her own staff to also agree. And they'd agreed with the Works Council that if they broke these principles, then they would not have access to data. So they've gone straight in to really say, right, we've really got to tackle this issue. If we want to keep operating, if we want to keep having data, we have to build really trusting, open, transparent relationships with works councils and with employees. And I think that, for me, I think the business benefits of trust are really, as Mary said, it will help build data analytics skills in your business. HR will have to get better and understand the use of analytics, even if it doesn't actually do it. Business leaders will have to understand what is valid, what they can ask for, what's important, what is strategic, what is valuable to the business and valuable to employees. And I think as well, that in general, I think that looking at trust will help you to build a more data-driven culture and a culture that appreciates data, but also perhaps has a new and better understanding of what matters to your employees and how they view privacy. And it is complex, and therefore a one-size approach is not going to work. Some of our members were talking about, we operate in 50 different countries, with different cultural attitudes. So we really have to figure this out and have different types of conversations.
Yeah, so I just wanted to throw in, Marion, if you're a US-based company or a company operating in the US and you're thinking, wait a minute, we don't have works councils. One of the things we've seen in human capital analytics is companies having employee representation of some sort, and that's part of this data oversight process, so that you have feet on the ground who lend some sort of credibility and legitimacy to what you're doing. And there's, again, transparency to what that looks like and what their role is and what that's even when you don't have works councils, you can figure out ways to make this more transparent and less mysterious and subject to people's projections about what management's doing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you both. Trust and open and transparent communication really is a foundation for organizations to ensure their compliance. So I know we have a couple more minutes. So Mary, any additional insights and anything else to share with our audience before we close? What are some positives or advantages, additional advantages that you can think of?
So we hear companies say that getting good at this ahead of your competitors, building a reputation so that it helps you attract talent, it increases employee engagement because people really trust and respect how you're going about this. It can become part of your external brand. And if you become successful at effectively leveraging personal data, this could really become a competitive advantage. And the opposite is also true. Going back to everybody's favorite example of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, if that were an isolated incident, which it's not, but that would already present unbelievable challenges for overcoming that in terms of brand, reputation, trust, etc. People spoke to us about the potential damage that would happen if on Glassdoor people started talking about your violation of privacy. If people who had been candidates and were asked, may we retain your resume, and had said no, if they later get emails from a recruiter, well, that's a source of embarrassment. So I think, that was one of my part. We hear about the potential advantage. I think that's untested, but theoretically it's credible. And we also hear about the potential damage. And you've got a much more difficult time if you're a company like the one Marion described. We already have an antagonistic relationship with your works council. We interviewed another company where there was a very strong relationship between human capital analytics and the works council. And the works council would sometimes say, well, you don't have to come and tell us about every time you analyze some data. That's really all right. We trust you. But they had built that relationship over time. So I think that would be my parting thought.
I think if I'm allowed, I think we do have to be candid that there are some negatives, that this is not going to be easy for companies. There are some companies out there who are really saying we are going to lose a competitive advantage in the area of workforce data, that there will be people who outside the GDPR who can move much faster enough. I think that could be true. I think this is going to be a very difficult and bumpy time for organizations. They're going to have to find their way through it. But I think I think when it comes to the area of big data could pose a big problem. HR is very interested in how it can benefit from big data. But there are a number of concerns. For example, the use of algorithms. there's a concern that the GDPR does not allow you to just go fishing for data. You can't just throw data at something and then look for the patterns and correlations. You have to have a specific purpose. So you have to start with the question and the purpose. And so you can't just sort of data mine and see what happens. So that's a big negative, really. There's a worry under GDPR that machine learning is not transparent enough. There's a worry that is any sort of data truly anonymous, that it can be somehow reconfigured back and become identifiable. The GDPR does not allow automated decision making. You're going to have meaningful human intervention. That may mean have certain consequences for talent acquisition, for hiring processes. There's a tendency, companies like to collect all the data. The GDPR has the limitation of how much data how long you can store your data, and there's a whole question mark about repurposing of data. So you've got some data, you think, oh, let's go and look at something else. Well, you won't necessarily be able to do that under GDPR. So these are big challenges that companies are going to have to navigate.
Thank you so much, Mary and Marion, for those good insights and questions that pop up. And really enjoyed our conversation. So nice to have both of you on this webcast. So unfortunately, we are running out of time. So audience, if you're interested in the details of what we've shared today, so our report is coming out soon. It'll be released sometime next week, the end of June, and it's titled The Long Arm of the Law, GDPR's Impact on HR Data. It can be found on the Conference Board website by clicking the link on your screen. And we also have an EU webcast coming out on June the 28th. It's still on the GDPR topic, but with more focus on human capital analytics. And our next Human Capital Watch is also Mary's research. It's called Digital Transformation, What is HR's Role? And specifically, she will talk about the 8 key areas where HR can contribute to the digital transformation and what skills HR leaders need to have in order to be effective in this changing environment. So please register now if you're interested in this topic. And additional related resources from the Conference Board. We have 2 publications. One is about 23 truths about cybersecurity, insights from the cybersecurity conference, crucial collaborations. We also have our annual survey on C-suite challenge, and this report is particularly focusing on the reinventing the organization for the digital age. If you are in the coaching space, we have a webcast called The Role of Technology in Coaching on July the 3rd. And the 14th Annual Organizational Design Conference will be held on November 8th and 9th. And thank you again for joining us today, and please share with us your feedback so that we can improve in the future.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.